Okay. We're continuing this morning in our study of the life of Christ. We are going to look at, hopefully get through 3 different events this morning. And I wanted to begin with, I've got, Gary's going to throw me a map up there. I want to give you kind of a general idea of where we're talking about, because we're going to be doing a lot of moving in this particular chapter. It begins near the Sea of Galilee, which you see near the top of the map. He then left the Sea of Galilee and went all the way across to Tyre and Sidon, which was actually in Phoenicia. It's not even in Israel. It's not a part of the Jews' country. It's part of Gentile country. He stayed there for a while. We're going to talk about some of the things that occurred there. He left Tyre, went north to Sidon, all the way back across Palestine, back down to the southern part of the Sea of Galilee. And then at the end of that, he ends up moving and going back up to Caesarea Philippi, which is north of the sea. So he did a lot of traveling in these couple of chapters. There had been, in chapter 7, the beginning of chapter 7, there had been kind of a confrontation with the Pharisees and the Sadducees. They had come to Jerusalem to confront Christ. And in verse 24, he talks about the fact that he arose and went to the region of Tyre and Sidon. There may have been a reason for that. The Scripture doesn't give it. But it may well have been for the fact that Christ wanted to get somewhere where he could spend some time with just his disciples. Because if he goes to Tyre and Sidon, the Pharisees and the Sadducees are not going with him. Gentile country was considered them unclean. They did not go to Gentile country unless they specifically had to. And so if he went to Tyre and Sidon, he could get away from the Pharisees and Sadducees for a while. The animosity between them is growing. It's not yet the appointed time for Christ to die, and so he doesn't want to hasten that animosity. And so he heads to Tyre and Sidon. Tyre was about 100 miles northwest of Jerusalem, very near the Mediterranean coast. It's about 50 miles from Nazareth. During David's time, and during Old Testament time, it was a very important seaport where a lot of the stuff that was shipped in from parts of Europe into that part of the world would come in. Now you'll notice there he says, it says in verse 24, he entered a house and did not want anyone to know. Jesus kind of didn't want anybody to know he was there. Now if you can imagine, think about popular people today, it's hard for them to go anywhere. Everybody knows where they're at. And although they didn't have the modern types of communication back then that we do, Jesus was a very popular individual. And everywhere he went, there were people that gathered, there were crowds, there were people that followed him. And so it was very difficult to keep his whereabouts a secret. And he gets to Tyre, and it says, the woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit heard of him and came and fell down at his feet. Now, the probability is, and I think it's a very high probability, this woman was not a Jew. In fact, it says she was a Syro-Phoenician. She was half Syrian, half Phoenician. She may have been, in fact, I read the story, I get the idea she may have been a believer in God because of some of the things she says and the way she reacts. We'll look at that as we move through. She said she was Syro-Phoenician by birth. She begged him to cast a demon out of her daughter. Her daughter was possessed. It was causing all kinds of problems. Jesus said, let the children be fed first, for it is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to dogs. When you read the parallel passage in Mark and Luke, you get the idea that for at least some short period of time, Jesus just ignored her. She's crying out to him, she's crying out, and he just ignores her. It gets to the point where the disciples say to Jesus, send her away, get rid of her, get her out of here, she's bugging us to death, send her away. And so then he looks at her, and you would think that what Jesus said to her would have insulted her. Don't give the children's bread to dogs. In the context, what Jesus is saying is the children of Israel are the children, the Gentiles are the dogs. If somebody called you a dog, would you be insulted? And there's a couple of things we need to understand about this. The first one is, what is one of the easiest ways to tell whether somebody is mad at you or not when they are talking to you? The tone of their voice. I don't know what tone. Jesus may have said that with a sparkle in his eye. He may have had a smile on his face. We just don't know. We don't have any idea what his tone was, what his presentation was. But it's interesting, she wasn't insulted. At least she was. She didn't act that way. She said in verse 28, "Yea, Lord, but even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." And we've talked before about the fact that most of the dogs in the first century were not domesticated animals. Most of them were wild. They ran all over the place. They were like wild animals. There were, however, some richer people who had pets. And these are what you get the picture. You're sitting at a huge banquet table. People are there eating, and underneath that table are these dogs. And they're eating the crumbs that are falling off the table. One individual even suggested that some of those people in the first century would take a piece of bread and use it like a napkin to wipe the stuff off their face, and then they would throw the bread on the floor. And the dogs would eat it. Now Jesus tells this woman, "I'm sent just to the house of Israel. The children of Israel come first." And she says, she doesn't say that's not right. "Yes, Lord, you're right. But the dogs eat the crumbs. I'll take the crumbs. You don't have to give me the bread. You don't have to give me the steak. You don't have to give me the fancy. I'll take the crumbs." Now, it seems to me that in this conversation here, she had some kind of understanding about God's relationship with the children of Israel. She knows that the Jews are God's special people because of the way that she reacts. She may very well have been a Gentile who believed in God. We sometimes get the idea that in the Old Testament, when God chose the Gentiles, or chose the Jews and not the Gentiles, that all the Gentiles were pagans. That's not necessarily so. God still had a relationship with Gentile people. Go read the book of Jonah. So there were still Gentiles under the old law who worshiped God. One of the best examples of that is turn to Acts chapter 10 and read about Cornelius. And so the Jews were a special people. The Jews were set aside as a special people to have a nation to whom to bring the Messiah. That does not mean God just threw away all the Gentiles and said, "All you people are out of luck." No, God doesn't do that. And so she answered him, "Yes, Lord, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." And he said to her, "For this statement, the demon has left your daughter." And she went home and found the child lying in bed and the demon gone. When you read your parallel passage in the book of Matthew, it specifically says Jesus looked at this woman and said, "Great is your faith. Your faith is great because of your great faith." Do you know Jesus only commended two people in the New Testament for their great faith? Both of them were Gentiles. Matthew chapter 8, the centurion, remember he healed the centurion's daughter? And Jesus said, "Your great faith." That's the only two times in the Gospels Jesus talked about somebody's great faith. It's interesting to me, both times it's Gentiles, not Jews. She went home and found that the child was healed. Verse 31, he left Tyre and went through Sidon. That is, he went north to Sidon. Through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee. He went north and then went all the way across the land of Palestine, all the way back to the Sea of Galilee. Now he ended up at Decapolis, which is the southern tip of the Sea of Galilee. There are some people who think he came down on the western side of Galilee. There are other people who think he went across and came down the eastern side, so that he would not be back in Galilee again. Whether that's the case, I don't know. It doesn't say. They brought to him a man who was deaf and had a speech impediment, and they begged him to lay his hand on him. And taking him aside from the crowd privately, he put his fingers in his ears, and after spitting touched his tongue. I read all kinds of people who tried to say, well, this is why Jesus put his finger in his ear, this is why Jesus spit, this is why. I don't have any idea. I just don't know. And looking up to heaven, he sighed and said, Ephphatha, that is, be open. That's the Aramaic term for be open. His ears were open and his tongue was released, and he spake plainly. Evidently, he had some kind of a stuttering problem or speech impediment. He couldn't talk clearly. It may have been connected to the fact that he was deaf. But Christ not only healed his deafness, he healed his speech impediment. He now can hear clearly. He can speak clearly. And Jesus charged him to tell no one. How do you think that went? If I'm deaf and dumb, and somebody comes in and heals me miraculously, you think I'm going to keep my mouth shut? I'm going to tell everybody I got in contact with. Now, the reason Jesus is saying that tell no one, he's trying to avoid that early confrontation with the Pharisees. He knows it's coming. He knows his death is coming. He knows his time is coming. But he doesn't want that to happen out of the time frame that God had set. And so he's trying to keep some of these things as quiet as he can. Verse 27, they were astonished beyond measure. He had done all things well. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. I want to make one more point before we move on to the next thing. Does anyone remember any important event that occurred in this area on the southern end of the Sea of Galilee a few chapters before? I'll give you a hint. His name was Legion. Remember the guy that Jesus healed threw all the demons out of, and they got in swine and ran off in the lake? What did they tell him after that happened? What did those people in that area tell Jesus after that happened? Leave. Get out of here. Go away. We don't want you. Now, look, he's back in the same region, and they are amazed at him and talking about what a great job he's doing. What changed their mind? I can't really say for certain, but I'm going to make one suggestion. Remember what Jesus told that man to do when he got in the boat and left? Go back and tell everybody you know about what has happened to you. You think maybe he had been doing that for the last year? Maybe he had been talking about Jesus. That may have had something to do with the fact that these people now accepted Jesus, and sometime before they had rejected him. Mark chapter 8. Now, the first thing I want to look at, and I've got it on the end of my thing, but I'm going to look at it first. Earlier in Matthew and Mark, there was recorded a thing where Jesus fed 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fishes. We're going to be looking here at Mark chapter 8 in an incident where Jesus fed 4,000 people with 7 loaves and a few fish. And there are individuals, there are scholars who try to make those two events the same thing. There are some differences, and I want to look just a couple minutes at the differences between these two stories. Let you know that they are definitely two different stories, not the same one. The first one is, the first feeding was 5,000. Now when it says 5,000, you remember it says 5,000 men. Does not count women and children. Could have been 10,000, could have been 15, could have been 20, we don't know. 5,000 men. This one is 4,000. Less people. The first one, near the northern part of the Sea of Galilee, was primarily Jews. Scholars seem to think this one is primarily Gentiles because of the region he was in. The first one was at the northern end of the Sea of Galilee. This one is at the southern end of the Sea of Galilee. The first one was 5 loaves and 2 fish. This one is 7 loaves and a few fish. It doesn't say how many, so we don't have any idea. When they took up the fragment with the 5,000, they got 12 baskets. And the word is translated basket there means like a small picnic basket. This story, it says they got 7 large baskets. And the word translated basket there is the same word that's found in Acts chapter 9. When Paul was in Damascus and they dropped him down over the wall in a basket, that's the word. So we're talking about the difference between a small basket and a basket big enough to put a person in. And so at least those things are different. These are not two different tellings of the same story. The reason they do that is they try to say, well, see, this one contradicts that one because this one says 5,000 and that one says 4,000. This one says this and that one says that. Well, it says that because it's two different stories. Not talking about the same thing. Talking about two different things. In those days, when a great crowd had gathered and they had nothing to eat, he called his disciples to him and said to them, I have compassion on the crowd because they have been with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. Now, the probability is when they came to Jesus, they brought food with them. But in 3 days, they ran out because they didn't bring 3 days' worth. He's have compassion on them. They need to eat. And if I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on their way, and some of them have come from far away. They've come from a long way off. And if I send them back without any food, they're not going to make it. They're going to pass out before they get there. His disciples answered him, how can one feed these people and bread here in this desperate place? When you read that verse, what's the first thing that pops into your mind? First thing pops into mind anyway. What had Jesus just done a few chapters before? He had fed 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fish, and those disciples were there. They saw that. Why is their reaction? How are we going to feed these people? We're in a desolate place. We're in the middle of nowhere. Where are we going to buy? You would think that this kind of situation would automatically brought back to mind what had happened before. And he asked them, how many loaves do you have? And they said 7. Now, this conversation probably didn't take place in the 35, 40 seconds it took me to read this. How many loaves do you have means they had to go find out how many loaves they had. Go talk to the people and see who's got food. 7 loaves. Now, we mentioned when we talked about this before, these loaves are not, when we talk about a loaf of bread, we're talking about that long thing you get it store. A loaf of bread in the first century was a little round. And it was usually that little round little round piece of bread usually fed one person. Everybody got their own loaf. And so when you think about 7 loaves, you can make a lot of sandwiches out of 7 loaves of bread. We're not talking about that. We're talking about this. Yeah. Now, the probability, I can't prove this, but the probability is this was unleavened bread because they were carrying it on a journey. And leavened bread would spoil pretty quick. The probability, I can't prove it, but the probability is it was unleavened, which meant it was hard. You also have to remember that in that day and age, bread was considered the staple of everybody's diet. Everybody had bread. You grew wheat, you grew barley, you grew whatever grain you could, you made your own. Not everybody had meat. We talked before about the fact when Jesus talks about little birds, that there were poor people who ate those birds because that's all they could afford. No, my wife talks about this all the time. I don't think I've had a meal if I don't have meat. I need some kind of meat. They would oftentimes go weeks with no meat at all. They ate what they could afford, what they could find, what they could grow, what they had. And so meat was not a staple of their diet. He directed the crowd to sit down on the ground. He took the 7 loaves, and having given thanks, he broke them and gave them to the disciples to set before the people, and they set them before the crowd. Now, if you read that, that's very similar to what happened when he fed 5,000. He set them down. He put them in groups so they could be easier to serve. He gave thanks, and then he fed them. Now, what we don't know, and we talked about this before, I don't know whether the bread multiplied when Jesus gave thanks, or if it just, as they handed it out, it just kept growing back. I don't know that, because Scripture doesn't say. But they did have, they took all these loaves, they had a few small fish. We mentioned last time, those small fish were probably similar to what we call sardines. They were salted and they were preserved so that you could carry them places. You have to remember, they didn't have freezers and refrigerators and all this kind of stuff to keep food. So the way they preserved food was with salt. Well, they salted these fish, and they were very small, and they had a few of those. Now, how many they had, I don't have any idea, because he doesn't say. And they ate and were satisfied. And they took up the broken pieces left over, 7 baskets full. How much food do you think it took to feed 4,000 men, plus women and children, to the point they were satisfied? And you also have to take into consideration, this is 3 days. They might not have eaten anything in a day and a half. These people were really hungry because Jesus was afraid to send them home because he was afraid they'd pass out on the way. They're pretty hungry. Can you imagine how much bread and fish it would take to feed 4,000 people, plus women and children, till they were satisfied? Now, you would probably get satisfied before I did. I eat a lot. And some of us don't eat much. Some of us eat a lot. But they ate till they were satisfied. They ate till they were full. They ate till they didn't want to eat anymore. And they had 7 baskets left over. And we're talking about big, huge baskets. Not little bitty ones, big ones that you could put a person in. Left over. I think the lesson there is God abundantly provides for what we need. He didn't give them just a little snack to get by till they could get to the store or they could get home. He fed them a full meal. More than they asked for, more than they needed, more than they wanted. And had 7 baskets left over. Now again, we talked about this with the last one. They had 12 baskets. What happened to the baskets? What happened to the baskets here? I don't have any idea. I assume somebody got them. I assume somebody used them, but I don't know who. I mentioned last time, the suggestion was made with feeding 5,000. There was a little boy who brought the 5 loaves and 2 fish. They may have given him the baskets because he's the one that brought the food. I don't know that. There's also 12 baskets, which means each one of the apostles may have got a basket. I don't know. In this case, there's 7 baskets. I don't know what happened to them. Whether they, ate it together later or I just don't know. No, I promise you it wasn't wasted. Yeah. Now, I've mentioned on several occasions, one of the things that impresses me about Scripture, you read all the way through the Bible, the Old Testament and New Testament. God has always had a special care and concern for those who were poor. It was always at the top of his list as far as dealing with people was concerned, was taking care of those who were poor. Now, I've also talked about this. God did not say to poor people, you go sit down over here and we'll feed you. You remember the law of gleaning? When they harvested their crop, if it fell out, if it went around the corner and it fell off the wagon or they dropped, they were leaving. Why were they to leave it? The poor could go get it now. When the poor, they had to, number one, they had to go get it. Number two, they had to take the grain, they had to winnow it, they had to get the wheat or the barley out of it, and then they had to make the bread. They had to do something. God didn't say, just go over and sit down while I take care of it. You're poor, you don't have the capability to do it. I'll do what I need to do for you, and you do the rest. God doesn't do for man what man can do for himself. He never has. He expects us. You know, 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, if a man won't work, he'll let him eat. It doesn't say if a man won't work unless he's poor. Man won't work. I've always found it interesting, I try to point this out from time to time. It does not say if a man doesn't work. It just says if a man won't work. There are people who want to work who can't find work. There are people who want to work who don't have the ability to work. And so God has always made special care for those, but he has a special concern for those who are poor. There were about 4,000 people. He sent them away. It's interesting to me when you read the Gospels how many times Jesus sends the multitude away. You would think he's wanting to gather the crowd. Let's instead of 4,000, let's get 5,000, let's get 6,000, let's get 10,000, let's get 15, let's get 20. Send them away. After he fed the 5,000, he sent them away. Just, it's interesting to me. Immediately, he got into the boat with his disciples and went back to the district of Dalmanutha. Gary, could you bring that map back up for a minute? If you look down near the bottom of the Sea of Galilee, the probability is Jesus is traveling here and he's going up that eastern side and he crosses the Sea of Galilee in a boat and comes to Dalmanutha, which is kind of, it's not on this map, but it's kind of south of Bethany. Dalmanutha and Dalmatia are both in that region. And that's where he ended up going. And we're going to talk in our lesson this morning. When we left there, he went north to Caesarea Philippi. Way up at the top there where Gary's got the arrow. That's Caesarea Philippi. He's traveling all over the place, isn't he? That's kind of what he did. He moved from place to place. And it's interesting, you go back to, I did mention this when we talked about it, you go back to he went to Tyre and Sidon. He stayed in somebody's house in Tyre. Which means he stayed in whose house? Who's in Tyre? I'm not talking about a specific person, I'm talking about a group of people. Gentiles. Gentile. Jesus stayed in a Gentile house. Now, you and I, that doesn't mean a whole lot. In the first century, it did. Jews did not converse with Gentiles, much less live with them.
You're saying Gentiles, but they may have been what we would call half-breeds, because the 10 northern tribes had disseminated into the rest of the world.
It says here she was a Syro-Phoenician, which means she's half Syrian, half Phoenician. Tyre was, unfortunately, when the children of Israel took the land of Canaan, they were supposed to destroy it. They never took Tyre. Tyre was not taken captive until Nebuchadnezzar. An interesting thing was when Nebuchadnezzar took it, they took the rubble from him destroying Tyre and built a causeway out to a little island, and they built another city of Tyre on the island. And Nebuchadnezzar never got it. The Medo-Persians did the same thing. They got the city of Tyre, they never got the island. When Alexander the Great came along, he took the city and then he built his own causeway and went out to the island and destroyed the island of the city of Tyre. And so both were gone, but Tyre was an independent city, kind of a city-state throughout the Old Testament. It was not under Jewish control because they didn't take it. They didn't do what God told them to do. I've mentioned on several occasions. One of the most famous stories in the Old Testament, the story of David and Goliath. Do you know if the Israelites had obeyed God, there never would have been a Goliath? Because they would have destroyed the Philistines. The Philistines were one of the pagan nations that were in the land of Canaan. If they had destroyed the Philistines, Goliath would have never been born. It's interesting what happens when you don't do what God told you to do. And throughout their history, all the way up to the Babylonian Empire, the Philistines were a thorn in their side. And they had that thorn because they didn't get rid of it when they were supposed to. But well, at this point, the Pharisees are about when they found out, how they found out, I don't know. I'm sure they probably weren't happy with it. They weren't happy with anything Jesus did. When he healed a miracle, they tried to blame the devil for it. They were dead set against Christ. And whatever he said or whatever he did, they're going to twist it, they're going to use it to their own purposes. And they're going to get rid of Jesus. And so as far as they were concerned, Jesus did nothing good. Nothing. He's casting out devils by the prince of the power of Beelzebub. They really didn't think a whole lot before they made that statement. Because that's stupid. Why would Satan give Christ power to cast out his own demons? That doesn't make any sense. That's being your own best enemy. But they're trying to come, they're grasping at straws. They're coming with any kind of excuse they can get, any kind of story they can tell, any kind of thing they can grab hold on, and they're running with it. Because they know Jesus is a threat to their power position. Now understand, they were still looking for a physical earthly kingdom. But the fact of the matter is, if Jesus was coming to establish an earthly kingdom, and he had done so, the Pharisees are out the door. And the Sadducees as well. Their power base is gone because they're not going to be a part of Christ's kingdom. Now, we know it's not a physical kingdom, it's a spiritual one. But even if they were right, they know if he gets control, they're done. And what they're interested in is keeping their position of power, whatever price they have to pay to do that. We're in control here, and we're going to stay in control. And it doesn't matter what we have to do that. And these are people who bragged about being the people of God. The people of God acting that way. Anyone have a question or comment? I said I was trying to try to get through those three things. I got through them and I'm done. As has been the case for the last several months, our Sunday morning lesson this morning is going to be a continuation of this. We're going to be looking at Matthew 18. If no one else has any questions or comments, I'm done. What?
Concerning the apostles in this second Ephesians,
Uh-huh.
they were questioning people how they would lead these people. I tend to believe that sometimes you get in a train of thought, and it's very difficult to change the way you think. And that even though they had this experience with Jesus previously feeding the 5,000, they were still stuck in this train of thought
You think we still do that?
Definitely.
Do we ever doubt God? Do we ever try to find some human solution when God has the answer? I remember several years ago seeing a pillow that somebody had engraved or had crocheted. It said, God does the healing and the doctors get all the money. Oftentimes I've heard, somebody say, somebody's sick, that this happened. Well, all I can do is pray. There's no all you can do that. That's the most powerful thing you can do. That's the most important thing you can do. Because prayer is in reality calling God to your side. And there's nothing more powerful in the world that we can do.
It is very difficult to change the way
Yeah.
you think.
It's very difficult in a world, our entire world, the world that we live in, our society and everything, is physically oriented. It's hard to live a spiritual life in a spiritually or in a physically oriented world. All the decisions that we make, I take a job because it pays me more money. I live in a house because it's a better neighborhood, because it's a house that I like. I buy this car because it saves me gas. And there's nothing wrong with any of those decisions. But how do we make God a part of our daily life if we don't ever consider Him in the decisions that we make? If Scripture, if God, if our relationship with God, our relationship with each other, if that never comes into play when we're talking about what we're going to do or where we're going to go, then how is Christianity a part of us? We don't go to church on Sunday and go home Sunday night and take our Christianity and set it on the shelf and leave it there till next Sunday. It's supposed to be a daily thing, which means my entire life is lived in service to Him, which means He's got something to do with what I do tomorrow. And Tuesday, and Wednesday, and Thursday, and Friday, and Saturday. And there are a lot of things that happen in our life. I still believe that happen because God is there. I've mentioned on several occasions, I think I'm in Van Buren, Arkansas because God wanted me here. I can't prove that beyond a shadow of a doubt, but I believe that. I think there are things that happen. I've mentioned this before, and I know I said I was through, but I try to point this out from time to time. The book of Esther is the answer to a trivia question. You've probably heard me say this before. The book of Esther is the only book in the Bible where the name of God is never mentioned. Not one time. You go home and read it and tell me that you don't see God in that book. The providence of God is working behind the scenes. Because we don't do miracles anymore, doesn't mean God's not involved. He's still there, and He's still working. And He's working behind the scenes to make sure that His will is fulfilled and that His people are taken care of. So He's still there. And He always will be. And we need to take comfort in that. We need to take solace in that. Wherever I go, I never go by myself. I am with you always. Always. And that ought to be, we ought to take advantage of that. I'll take great comfort in that God is in our life. Now, I'm done.